In this Blender video, I'll be demonstrating how to make this animation of a machine making some text. For this video, I'll be using Blender version 2.78c. Let's start by creating a new project. So from the File menu, select New, and then click on Reload Startup File. To make it easier to see the scale and location of the objects that we'll be adding, switch from Perspective to Orthographic View by pressing 5 on the number pad. When we render the final animation, it will be in Perspective View. Now delete the cube by right-clicking on it to select it, and then press X to delete. Now we're going to make some text that will be built up in layers so that it won't look hollow inside. So start by pressing Shift-A and select Text. Then rotate it on the X-axis by pressing R, then X, then 90, then Enter. To edit the text, press the Tab key for edit mode. Then backspace to delete the default text and enter in your own text. Then press Tab to return to object mode. Next, we're going to add some thickness to the text. Normally I would do this by clicking the Object Data button and adding an extrude value. But this time I'm going to use a solidify modifier, which will give it a little different look. So add a solidify modifier. And set the thickness value to 0.01. Now add a remesh modifier. This will make the mesh more uniform. Remove the check mark that's next to Remove Disconnected Pieces so that the modifier will be applied to all of the letters. Now we'll set the octree depth value. You'll want to use the smallest value that will give you acceptable results. So I'll increase the value while I watch the text. A value of 7 looks pretty good, except that part of the last letter looks pinched. So I'm going to use a value of 8. Next, add a check mark next to Smooth Shading. This will round off the edges. Now add an array modifier. We're going to use 10 copies of this text layered next to each other to give the text its overall thickness. So remove the check mark that's next to Relative Offset and add a check mark next to Constant Offset. Then set the Z value to 0.01 and set the count to 10. This text, since it's built in layers, will not look hollow during the parts of the animation where the inside of the text can be seen. Now let's add a material for the text. So click the Material button and then click New. Then come up here and change this from Blender Render to Cycles Render. Then click the Use Nodes button. And set the surface type to Glossy. Set the color to a hex value of 858585. Then set the roughness to 0.05. This will give the text a metal look. Next, let's set up the lighting. So press 7 on the number pad for top view. Then right-click the lamp to select it. Then press G to move and drag it until it's 3 large grid divisions below the center and 1 large grid division to the left of the center. Now press 1 on the number pad for front view and verify that the lamp is about 6 large grid divisions above the center. Now click the Object Data button if it's not already selected. Make sure that the point lamp is selected and set the size to 3. Then click the Use Nodes button and set the strength to 3000. Next, we're going to add a floor, so press Shift-A and add a mesh plane. Scale it up in size by pressing S, then 100, then Enter. Then drag it to the bottom of the text. Now we'll set the material for it, so click the Material button and then the New button. We'll keep the diffuse surface type. Set the color to a hex value of 989898. Now let's set the background color. So click the World button and set the color to black. Now I'll switch to rendered view so that we can see what we have so far. Now switch back to solid view. Next, we're going to set up dynamic paint. To use dynamic paint, objects are set up as brushes and canvases. In our case, a sphere that we'll be adding soon will be the brush, and the text will be the canvas. After the dynamic paint is set up, we'll be able to use some nodes to make the text become visible as it's painted with the sphere. In order to set up the text to be used as a canvas, we need to convert it to a mesh first. So right-click the text to select it. Then press Alt-C and select Mesh from Curve Meta Surf Text. Now click the Physics button. You may need to resize this panel on the right to bring the Physics button into view. Next, click the Dynamic Paint button. Make sure Canvas is selected and then click the Add Canvas button. Verify that the surface type is set to paint. Now let's add the sphere that we'll be using as a brush. So press Shift-A and add a UV sphere. Then scale it down in size by pressing S, then 0.15, then Enter. Now click the Dynamic Paint button. Then click the Brush button and then the Add Brush button. We'll keep all of the default settings. Now we're going to animate the position of the sphere so that it passes back and forth across the text. As it passes across the text, it will be painting it. So let's move the sphere into its initial position. So press 3 on the number pad for right side view and then drag the sphere to the center of the text. Then press 1 on the number pad for front view and drag the sphere until there is one grid division between the sphere and the text. Now we'll set a keyframe, so set the frame number to 20. Then press I and select Location. Next, set the frame number to 50. Then drag the sphere on the x-axis until the left edge of the sphere is even with the right edge of the text. Then press I and select Location. Now set the frame number to 55. Then drag the sphere up until the top of the sphere is just below this bottom tip of the R. Then press I and select Location. Next, set the frame number to 80. Then drag the sphere on the x-axis until there is one grid division between the sphere and the text. Then press I and select Location. Now set the frame number to 85. Then drag the sphere up until the center of the sphere is even with the bottom edge of the hole in the B. Then press I and select Location. Now set the frame number to 110. Then drag the sphere until the left edge of the sphere is even with the right edge of the text. Then press I and select Location. Next, set the frame number to 115. Then drag the sphere up until its bottom edge is even with the top of the R. Then press I and select Location. Now set the frame number to 140. Then drag the sphere until there is one grid division between the sphere and the text. Then press I and select Location. Now set the frame number to 150. Then move it up on the Z-axis by pressing G, then Z, then 1, then Enter. Then press I and select Location. Now I'll set the frame number to 1 and press the play button so that we can watch the sphere paint the text. You might notice that there are a few small spots that didn't get painted. This is okay because I want the text to look a little rough. Next, let's set up the material. Earlier, we set up the text material to look like metal. Now we're going to modify it to be transparent until it's painted. So right-click the text to select it. Then set the frame number to 1. Then press play and stop it when it reaches about frame 80 so that it's only partially painted. Now switch to the compositing screen layout. Then click the Shader Nodes button. I'll switch to rendered view so that we can see the changes as we make them. Now we're going to mix in a transparent shader. So press Shift A and select Shader, and then Mix Shader. Drop it on the connection coming out of the glossy shader. Then move the output of the glossy shader to the bottom Mix Shader input. Now press Shift A and select Shader, and then Transparent. Connect it to the Mix Shader input. Make sure that the color is set to the maximum white value so that it will be completely transparent. Now we're going to add an attribute node so that we can control where the text is visible and where it's transparent. So press Shift A and select Input, and then Attribute. Now click the Physics button. You may need to expand the panel on the right to bring the Physics button into view. This is the Dynamic Paint setup for the text. Open the Dynamic Paint Output section. We're going to be using the Paint Map layer in the Attribute node. So click this plus button to add it. Now we need to copy this name into the Attribute node's entry box. You can just type the name if you'd like, but I'm going to select it and use Ctrl-C to copy it, and Ctrl-V to paste it. Now connect the factor output to the Mix Shader's factor input. You'll notice now that the inside of the text looks black. This is because we are being limited by the number of transparent bounces in the Light Paths section. To fix this, click the Render button and open the Light Paths section. Set the max transparency value to 100, which should be more than enough. Now the top half of the text where it hasn't been painted yet is transparent. But you'll notice that the bottom half of the text is partially transparent instead of being opaque. To fix this, we're going to add a Math node. So press Shift A and select Converter, and then Math. Drop it on the output of the Attribute node. Set the Math type to Multiply. Then change the multiply value to 100. Now the bottom of the text is opaque. Now return to the default screen layout. This is a good time to save what I have so far. So from the File menu, I'll select Save As. I'm going to name it machine.blend. We're going to be adding a particle system, and the particles themselves will be icospheres. So let's add an icosphere object now. So press Shift A and select Mesh, and then Icosphere. Then drag it down below the floor so that it can't be seen. To add the particle system, right-click the sphere to select it. Then click the Particles button, and then the New button. Now we'll set up the particles to be icospheres. So come down to the Render section. Then click the Object button and select the icosphere that we added earlier. Set the size to 0.01. So that the particles will not all be the same size, set the random size value to 0.5. Then remove the check mark that's next to Emitter so that the sphere itself will not be visible when the animation is rendered. Now come up here and set the number of particles to 3000. We want the particles to be visible throughout the entire animation, so I'm going to set the lifetime value to a large value that is greater than the total number of frames in the animation. I'm going to use 1000. Next, we're going to set up the start and end frame values. To determine when the particles should start being emitted, scrub along the timeline until the sphere touches the first letter. This is where we want the particles to start. In this case, we're at frame number 24. So I'll use this frame number for the start value. Now scrub the timeline until the sphere is at the end of the text. In this case, we're at frame number 45. So I'll use this frame number for the end value. If I scrub the timeline, you can see the particles being generated. Now we're going to add another particle system to emit particles while the sphere passes back across the text to the left. To add another particle system, click this plus button. This particle system is going to be very similar to the one that we just added. So let's copy the first particle system and just modify it. So select the first particle system from this drop-down menu. Then click this plus button to make a copy of it so that we don't affect the first particle system. Now scrub the timeline until the sphere touches the last letter. This brings us to frame 60 where we want this particle system to start. But Blender won't let us enter a start value that is larger than the end value, so temporarily set the end value to 200. Then set the start value to 60. Now scrub the timeline until the sphere is at the beginning of the text. This brings us to frame 77, which we'll use for the end frame value. Now when I scrub the timeline, you can see that the particles are generated until we reach the end of the text, and then they start again when the sphere moves in the other direction. Now let's add another particle system. So just like before, click this plus button and then select the first particle system from the drop-down menu. Then click this plus button to make a copy. Now scrub the timeline until the sphere touches the first letter. This brings us to frame 88, which will be the start value. So temporarily set the end value to 200, then set the start value to 88. Now scrub the timeline until the sphere is at the end of the text. This brings us to frame 107. Use this frame number for the end value. Now let's add another particle system. So click this plus button and then select the first particle system. Then click this plus button to make a copy. We don't need as many particles for this one, so set the number of particles to 500. Now scrub the timeline until the sphere reaches the top of the D. This brings us to frame 124. We're only going to emit particles for 2 frames, so set the end frame value to 126 and the start value to 124. Now we're going to add one more particle system. So click this plus button and then select the first particle system. Then click this plus button to make a copy. Set the number of particles to 700. Then scrub the timeline until the sphere reaches the L. This brings us to frame 131. So temporarily set the end value to 200 and then set the start value to 131. Now scrub the timeline until the sphere is at the beginning of the text. This brings us to frame 137. Use this frame number for the end value. Now I'll move the frame number to 1 and press the play button so that we can see the particles being generated. You'll notice that all of the particles fell through the floor. To prevent this, we'll enable collision for the floor. So right-click the floor to select it. Then click the Physics button and then the Collision button. To prevent the particles from bouncing on the floor, set the particle damping factor value to 1. To prevent the particles from sliding too far on the floor, set the particle friction factor value to 0.2. Now I'll move the frame number to 1 and press the play button so that we can see what it looks like. This time the particles are not falling through the floor. Next, we're going to set up these particles to glow like hot metal when they're first created, and then turn into a non-glowing metal to give the appearance of cooling. So find the icosphere in the outliner and select it. Add a new material to it and set the surface type to glossy. Set the color to a hex value of 858585. Then set the roughness value to 0.05. These settings will make it look like a metal material. Now set the frame number to 1 and press the play button. Then stop it when it reaches about frame 70 so that we can see the particles as they're being generated. Now switch to the compositing screen layout. To make the particles glow, we're going to mix in an emission shader. So press Shift A and select Shader, and then Mix Shader. Drop it on the connection coming out of the glossy shader. Then move the glossy shader output to the bottom mix shader input. Now press Shift A and select Shader, and then Emission. Connect it to the mix shader input. Set the emission shader color to a hex value of E74600. Then set the strength value to 10. To make the particles glow only when they're first created, we need to add a particle info node. So press Shift A and select Input, and then Particle Info. We want the particles to change with age, so connect the age output to the mix shader's factor input. You can see that the particles start out using the emission shader and then quickly change into the glossy shader. You can control how long it takes for the change to occur by adding a math node. I like the length of time that it's currently taking, but I'll show you how to add the math node in case you want something different. So press Shift A and select Converter, and then Math. Drop it on the age output. Then set the math type to multiply. Now if you use a smaller multiply value, the change from emission shader to glossy shader will take longer. I'm going to use a value of 1. Now switch back to the default screen layout. Now we're going to add an object that's intended to look like it's the source of the metal. So press Shift A and add a mesh cylinder. Set the number of vertices to 8. This change needs to be made before any other changes are made to the cylinder. Next, scale it down in size by pressing S, then 0.08, then Enter. Then scale it up in size on the Z-axis by pressing S, then Z, then 3.4, then Enter. Now press Tab for edit mode. Then press A once or twice until nothing is selected. Then hold down the Alt key and right-click one of these top edges, which will select all of the edges around the top. Then scale it up in size by pressing S, then 2, then Enter. Then press Tab to return to object mode. Now we'll set the material for it. So add a new material and set the surface type to glossy. Set the color to a hex value of 5C, 5C, 5C. Then set the roughness value to 0.1. These settings will make it look like a dark metal material. Next, we'll move it into position. So press 7 on the number pad for top view. Then press G to move and drag it until it's aligned with the sphere. Then rotate it on the Z-axis by pressing R, then Z, then 22.5, then Enter. Now press 1 on the number pad for front view. Then drag it up until the bottom is even with the top of the sphere. We want this object to follow the sphere, so we're going to set up the sphere to be its parent. So with this object still selected, hold down the Shift key and right-click the sphere to add it to the selection. It's important that the sphere is selected last. Now press Ctrl P and select Object. Now when I scrub the timeline, you can see that the object moves with the sphere. Now we're going to add 2 rods that are intended to look like they're supporting this object. So press Shift A and add a mesh cylinder. Set the number of vertices to 32. Scale it down in size by pressing S, then 0.025, then enter. Then scale it up on the Z-axis by pressing S, then Z, then 400, then enter. Now rotate it on the Y-axis by pressing R, then Y, then 90, then enter. Next, drag it up until it's a little below the top of this object. Now press 7 on the number pad for top view. Then drag it until it's centered over the text. Now we'll set the material for it. So add a new material and set the surface type to glossy. Set the color to a hex value of 858585. Then set the roughness value to 0.05. These settings will make it look like a metal material. Now press 1 on the number pad for front view. We're going to duplicate the rod, so press Shift-D and drag it down a little. We want these two rods to follow the sphere, so we're going to set up the sphere to be their parent. So with this rod still selected, hold down the Shift key and right-click the other rod, and then the sphere to add them to the selection. It's important that the sphere is selected last. Now press Ctrl-P and select Object. Now when I scrub the timeline, you can see that the rods move with the sphere. Next, we'll set up the camera view. So press 0 on the number pad for camera view. This is the view looking through the camera. I'll zoom in a little. Now I'm going to lock the camera to the view. To do that, press N to open the Properties panel and put a check mark next to Lock Camera to View. Then press N again to close the Properties panel. Now I can zoom, pan, and rotate while looking through the camera. Next, I'm going to set the frame number to 150. This will put the sphere at its highest position. I'm doing this because I want to set up the scene so that the sphere will be above the top of the camera view window at the end of the video. Now I'll set up the view that I'd like to use. Now let's finish setting up the animation. The animation is going to be 170 frames long, so set the end frame value to 170. Now click the Render button and then open the Sampling section. I'm going to set the number of render samples to 50. The larger this value is, the better the final animation will look, but the longer it will take to render. Now come up to the Output section. This is where you set the directory where your animation will be saved. Click on this button and select a directory. Next, click here to set the file format. There are multiple movie formats that you can choose from. I'm going to use OGG Theora. Next, I'm going to change the resolution. I'm going to use an X value of 1280 and a Y value of 720. I'm also going to set this value to 100%. Now we're ready to render the animation, but I'm going to save the project first. It's a good idea to save the project before rendering in case something goes wrong during the rendering process. To render the animation, click on the Animation button. If you want to stop the rendering process before it's done, you can press the Escape key, or you can click the X next to the Render Progress bar. Now I'll pause the video until it's done. The animation is done rendering now. It took my computer about 50 minutes to render. This is the final frame that was rendered. If you want to return to the previous view, you can click this button and select 3D View. To view the animation, go to the Render menu and click on Play Rendered Animation, or you can press Ctrl F11. The animation will play through to the end and then start back at the beginning again. Now if you open up Windows File Explorer or something equivalent, you can navigate to your movie file. Now assuming that you have a video player that will play the movie format that you specified, You can now play your video. I've set up this player to repeat the video on a loop so that it will keep playing. Well, that concludes this video. Thanks for watching, and please subscribe and leave a comment.